I didn't want to do this.
I was 18 when my father promised me in marriage, a respected don, mature, powerful, and old enough to be my grandfather. I thought the hardest part would be walking up to that altar without falling apart, but I was wrong. The hardest part was meeting his son a few hours before the ceremony. Handsome, seductive, and dangerously calm, he looked at me in a way that made my entire body react, even though I didn't understand why. I had never felt that before. Never. And when there were only minutes left until the wedding, he came to the waiting room, approached me, and said, "You're going to marry my father, but I know it's me you want." In that moment, I knew I was lost, because for the first time in my life, I wanted to run. And it wasn't from the wedding, it was with the man I should never want. Hi, I'm Lena, and this story is just beginning. Chapter 1. The Dress I Didn't Choose. The dress was too beautiful for a day I hadn't chosen. White, fitted at the waist, with a train that dragged across the hotel room carpet as if it had been made for a woman who dreamed of this moment her whole life. I wasn't that woman. I was the one holding my breath in front of the mirror, trying to find in my own eyes something that looked like courage, and finding only the kind of resignation you learn when you grow up in a house where no one asks what you want. Petra was sitting on the edge of the bed behind me, legs crossed, and a glass of champagne she swore was strictly medicinal. She watched my reflection with that look only she could pull off, half concern, half calculation of when it would be safe to open her mouth without getting a pillow thrown at her face. "You're shaking," Petra said, tilting the glass in my direction as if offering a diagnosis. "I'm cold," I lied, adjusting the veil one of the stylist's assistants had pinned in my hair minutes before. "Elisa, it's July and this room is 82 degrees, she replied without hesitation, and I almost smiled because Petra had this irritating gift of destroying any lie of mine before it had time to stand on its own. I turned away from the mirror because looking at that version of myself was becoming unbearable. The woman in the reflection looked like a real bride, and the distance between what I looked like and what I felt was too great to fit in that room. Petra must have noticed, because she set down her glass on the nightstand and stood beside me, saying nothing for a few seconds, which coming from her was practically a hug. The truth is, I knew this day would come. I'd known since I was 18, since the afternoon my father called me into the office of the house where I grew up on the Upper East Side, and closed the door behind me with the same care he used to close deals no one walked away from alive. I remember every detail. The light coming through the Venetian blinds made stripes on the dark wood floor, and my father, Armando Vetrano, was sitting behind the desk with his hands folded over a leather folder I'd never seen before. He didn't ask me to sit. He never did. I sat anyway, because I'd already learned that standing before him was a kind of challenge I couldn't win. "You're forbidden from dating," he said, without looking up from the folder, "from going out alone with any man, from accepting invitations, gifts, or any kind of approach. Starting today, Elisa, you're promised." The word fell between us like a sentence. I opened my mouth, but he continued before I could make a sound, as if my reaction had already been anticipated and dismissed. "Cairo Carbone, the dawn of the Familia Carbone," he said, and this time he raised his eyes to me. "The wedding will be when he decides. Could be in a year, could be in 5, but it's already sealed." I felt my stomach drop. Cairo Carbone was more than 3 times my age. I'd seen him only once, from a distance, at a family dinner I'd been brought to as decoration. A man with graying hair, cold eyes, and the kind of presence that made people around him become smaller. I was 18, and he was already someone's grandfather. "Dad, please," I said, and my voice came out the way I hated, thin, trembling, with the weight of someone who knows they're begging a wall. "I don't know him. He's old enough to be my grandfather. You can't force me to do this." Armando looked at me for a long moment, and I searched that face for some trace of the man who, according to my mother before she died, used to carry me in his arms when I was little. I found nothing. "You don't have a choice, Elisa. This was decided before you were born," he said, and closed the folder like someone ending a business meeting. "Now get out. I have matters to handle." I left. I cried all night, alone, in the dark of my room, with my face buried in the pillow so no one would hear, because in that house, crying was a weakness, and weakness was the only thing my father didn't tolerate. That night, I understood with brutal clarity what I was to Armando Vetrano. Not a daughter, but a bargaining chip with an expiration date. 4 years had passed since that afternoon, and there I was, inside the dress I didn't choose, in the room of a hotel I didn't book, about to marry a man I didn't love. "Look on the bright side," Petra said, bringing me back to the present with that tone she used when she was trying to keep me from falling apart. She fixed a strand of my hair and looked at me with a half smile. "You'll be living in a mansion with 40 rooms. I stared at her through the mirror, and the answer came out before I could hold it back. "And sleeping alone in all of them." Petra pressed her lips together to keep from laughing, but her eyes betrayed her. She knew me too well to pretend this was just a joke, and I knew her too well to pretend it wasn't also a little bit true. We'd known each other since boarding school in Zurich, since we were 15, since the time she taught me to climb out the dorm window to steal chocolate from the kitchen at 2 in the morning. Petra Halm was the only person in the world I could be exactly who I was with, without fear that information would be used against me. "You're going to be fine," she said, and this time she wasn't trying to be funny. Her voice dropped, and she squeezed my hand hard. "I'm not going to let you disappear into this family, Elisa, even if I have to invade that mansion every week." I squeezed her hand back and swallowed the lump growing in my throat, because if I started crying now, the mascara wouldn't survive, and the makeup artist who'd taken 40 minutes to make my eyes look sophisticated and natural would probably have a nervous breakdown. The clock on the wall read 11:38. In less than an hour, I would be Cairo Carbone's wife. The idea felt unreal, like it belonged to someone else's life, a woman who was stronger, more prepared, more anything I wasn't. I stood in the middle of the room, with freezing hands and my heart beating too fast, listening to the muffled sound of the event staff downstairs and trying to convince myself I could get through this entire day without falling apart. And then I heard it. Firm footsteps in the hallway, stopping outside my room door. 2 knocks, sharp, deliberate, in the kind of rhythm that didn't belong to any of the assistants who'd been coming and going all morning. Petra and I looked at each other at the same time. "Are you expecting someone?" she asked, already on her feet, with the champagne glass suspended in the air like a weapon. I shook my head, and before either of us could decide what to do, the doorknob turned. Chapter 2. The Man at the Wrong Door. The door opened before I could decide whether I wanted it to open or not, and the man who appeared on the other side didn't belong in that hallway. I knew it the instant I saw him, the same way you know, by instinct, when someone enters a place and changes the weight of the entire air. He was tall, not the kind of tall you notice and forget, the kind that occupies the space around him, as if the space had been built for him. The suit was dark, cut in a way that followed every line of his body without trying to hide anything, and he wore the top button of his shirt open, as if formality were a suggestion he'd decided to ignore. His face was the kind of face that makes you lose your train of thought mid-sentence. Sharp jawline, dark and deep-set eyes, and a mouth that seemed permanently halfway between serious and dangerous. I looked at him and my first thought was, this man is not 62 years old. And the second, which came too fast for me to block it, was that no security guard in the world looked at a woman the way he was looking at me. "Wrong door," he said, and his voice was deep, controlled, with the kind of calm that belongs to someone who never needs to raise their voice to be heard. He stood in the doorway, one hand still on the doorknob, and made no move to leave. Petra, who was 2 steps behind me, went still. I felt her presence like a wide-eyed statue in the back of the room, but I didn't turn to confirm. "Wrong door," I repeated, crossing my arms in front of my chest, as if that would build some kind of barrier between us. "And yet you're still here." He tilted his head to the side, just an inch, and the corner of his mouth moved into something that wasn't a smile, but was worse than a smile, because a smile I would know how to ignore. "Are you okay?" he asked, and the way he said it caught me off guard. It wasn't protocol. It wasn't the polite question people ask when they don't really want to hear the answer. He asked like someone who looks at you and sees what you're hiding. "I'm in a white dress, about to get married, in a hotel room with champagne and flowers," I replied, and the sarcasm came out before I could hold it back, like a defense reflex I no longer controlled. What could be wrong? He looked at me for a second longer than acceptable, and in that second, I had the strange feeling that he'd heard everything I didn't say along with everything I did say. Then he extended his right hand toward me, a simple, formal gesture, the kind anyone would make when introducing themselves. But nothing about this man seemed simple. I hesitated. I don't know why I hesitated. Maybe because some part of me already knew that outstretched hand was a threshold, and that once I touched it, something would shift inside my chest. But I extended my hand anyway, because not extending it would be admitting he was having some effect on me, and I refused to admit that to a stranger who'd just walked into my room uninvited. His hand enveloped mine, and I felt it. It wasn't static. It wasn't the normal warmth of a handshake. It was a kind of current that traveled up my wrist and settled somewhere between my ribs, hot, undeniable, and without any name I knew to give it. His palm was firm, his fingers were long, and he held my hand for too long. I knew it was too long because my heart changed rhythm, and because he never looked away. He stayed there, still, his eyes on mine, as if memorizing something he intended to remember later. I pulled my hand back first. He let me pull it back, but the way his fingers slid as he released mine was slow, deliberate. as if letting go was a decision he was making against his own will. It was at that moment that Petra appeared in my field of vision. She was behind him, slightly to the left, and when I looked at her over the dark-suited man's shoulder, her eyes were so wide they seemed to take up half her face. Her mouth opened in a silent, "Oh," and then she made an exaggerated face in my direction. Eyebrows raised, jaw dropped, both hands spread in the air as if trying to tell me, "For God's sake, who is this man?" without making a single sound. I almost laughed. Almost. And the almost was enough for the knot in my chest to loosen for a second, just 1 second before tightening again. The man turned, noticed Petra standing there, and greeted her with a brief nod, without any embarrassment, as if finding a woman making faces behind him was a perfectly expected occurrence in his day. Then he looked at me one last time, said, "Good luck," in a voice that didn't seem to wish any luck at all, and left. The door closed behind him, and the room felt strangely empty, as if someone had taken the oxygen with them. Petra crossed the room in 3 steps and grabbed my arm with both hands. "Who was that man?" she whispered, even though there was no one else there to hear. "I don't know," I replied, and it was true. He hadn't said his own name. I hadn't asked, and now my hand was still warm in the place where he'd held it. I didn't have time to think about it further. The ceremony coordinator knocked on the door 2 minutes later and led me to the elevator, where a team of security guards was waiting to take me to the reception floor. Petra followed beside me, glancing at me sideways every 3 seconds, as if trying to read in my expression something I wasn't ready to admit even to myself. I learned who he was as we crossed the second-floor lobby. One of the guards moved ahead in our direction, not to speak to me, but to intercept someone walking in the opposite direction, and I heard, with cruel clarity, the phrase that changed the weight of that entire day. "Mr. Carbone, the Don asked that you go directly to the West Wing. The ceremony starts in—" I stopped walking. The guard kept talking, but his voice turned into a distant buzz because my brain had frozen on a single word: Carbone. I turned my head toward the man the guard had called, and it was him. The man from the wrong door, from the handshake that lasted too long, from the look that seemed to hold things I wasn't prepared to understand. He was a few yards from me, in profile, listening to the guard with the same controlled calm as before. And then, as if sensing my gaze, he turned his face in my direction. Our eyes met. He didn't smile, didn't wave, just looked at me, and I felt the current again, traveling the same path it had traveled when our hands touched. He knew I'd just discovered who he was, and he didn't seem surprised. Petra pulled my arm hard and made me start walking again. "Elisa," she said quietly, her voice tense. "Elisa, that's the son. That's Cairo's son." I didn't answer. I couldn't. The ceremony waiting room was a narrow space with cream fabric-lined walls and a mirror too large on the wall opposite the door. They placed me there to wait out the last minutes before the entrance, and Petra stayed with me, holding my hand without saying anything, because even she, who was never at a loss for words, had understood there was no phrase in the world that could improve that moment. There were less than 5 minutes left when the door opened again, and it was him. Noah Carbone entered the waiting room as if it were a space that belonged to him, as if all spaces belonged to him, and stopped less than 6 feet from me. His eyes traveled down my entire body, without disguise, without hurry, without the slightest trace of embarrassment, and then returned to my face with an intensity that made the dress feel thinner than it was. "You look beautiful," he said, and it wasn't a compliment. It was a statement, said with the same naturalness someone would say the sky is blue or fire burns. I wanted to respond. I opened my mouth to say something, anything that would break the absurd gravity of that moment, but he moved closer before the words came. 1 step, 2, too close. Close enough for me to feel the heat radiating from his body and the scent, woody, expensive, with a note of something I couldn't identify and that made my stomach tighten. He leaned toward me. His mouth stopped beside my ear, and I felt his breath on my skin, hot, slow, controlled. And then he whispered, in a voice that was little more than a low growl, "You're going to marry my father, but I know it's me you want." The air left my lungs. I didn't move, didn't answer, couldn't do anything but stand there, paralyzed, feeling the echo of those words travel through every inch of my body, as if they'd been written with fire. He pulled back slowly, looked into my eyes one last time, long, heavy, loaded with a promise I didn't want to understand, and left through the same door he'd entered, without looking back. Petra stared at me with her mouth open. "What did he say?" she asked, almost voiceless. I swallowed hard and adjusted the veil with shaking hands. "Nothing," I lied. And then the main door opened, the wedding march began to play, and I started walking toward the altar, where Cairo Carbone, the man I was about to marry, stood waiting with his hands folded in front of his body, and the expression of someone closing another deal. Cold, distant, proper, and 2 steps behind him, leaning against a column with his hands in his pockets, and his eyes fixed on me as if every step I took was toward him, and not toward his father, was Noah, looking at me as if the wedding were already his, as if I were already his, as if all of it, the dress, the altar, the rings, the vows, were nothing but a formality he intended to undo with time. I kept walking, and tried not to look at him, and failed. Chapter 3. The Don's Wife. Cairo Carbone said "I do" with the same intonation he probably used to approve contracts, precise, functional, and without any trace of emotion. I said "I do" too, but my voice came out lower than I intended, and I had the impression that the only people who actually heard me were the officiant and Petra, who was in the second row with red eyes and her nails dug into her own purse. The ceremony was short, elegant, and empty of everything a wedding should have. Cairo held my hand during the vows with the polite firmness of someone greeting an acquaintance at a social event, and when the officiant said he could kiss the bride, he pressed his lips to my forehead, not my mouth, in a gesture so brief it could have been imagined. I didn't know if this relieved me or saddened me, and that confusion stayed trapped in my chest like a knot that didn't belong to either thing. Throughout the entire ceremony, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I felt Noah there, 2 steps behind his father, leaning against that column. With the same certainty, I felt my own dress on my skin. It was a presence that didn't ask permission to be noticed, that existed in the air like a different atmospheric pressure, and that made me hold the vows with my hands firmer than necessary just to have something to anchor myself to. The dinner was set up in the hotel's main ballroom, with round tables covered in dark linen tablecloths and white flower arrangements that seemed almost aggressive in their perfection. I was placed at the central table next to Cairo, who exchanged exactly 4 sentences with me over the course of 2 hours, all related to the wine, the menu, and the logistics of leaving. None about me. None that indicated he saw in the woman sitting beside him anything more than a piece that had just been fitted into the right place on the board. It was in the interval between the second course and dessert that he appeared. Fausto Rennie approached my chair from the left side, with a smile that showed all his teeth, and a glass of red wine he held with his fingertips, as if even the act of drinking were a calculated performance. He was a 45-year-old man with the kind of beauty that had already passed its prime, features that had once been handsome, now hardened by time, and by something that lived behind his eyes that I couldn't name, but that made me want to pull back in my chair. "The most beautiful bride New York has seen in years," he said, leaning toward me with the familiarity of someone who'd known me for decades. "Fausto Rennie, underboss of the Rennie family from Chicago. I'm here as a diplomatic gesture, but I confess I'm more interested in the hostess than in diplomacy." I smiled because it was what was expected of me, and extended my hand, which he held for a second longer than comfortable. Cairo beside me didn't move, either because he didn't see, or because he didn't consider this man a threat worthy of a reaction. "Pleasure to meet you, Mr. Rennie," I replied, pulling my hand back with as much delicacy as I could simulate. "Tell me, Elisa," he said, and the way he pronounced my name gave me the feeling he was testing it in his mouth, testing its weight. "How did a young woman like you and a man like Cairo come to this arrangement? Do the Vetrano and Carbone families have an old alliance, or is this something recent?" The question was polite on the surface, but what was underneath it wasn't. Fausto wasn't interested in romance. He was interested in information. I recognized that tone because I grew up hearing my father use it at dinners, exactly like this one, phrases that seemed like casual conversation and were, in reality, probing. "A long-standing alliance," I replied on autopilot, with the trained smile Armando taught me to use when I didn't want to say anything and needed to look like I was saying something. "Mr. Carbone and my father have known each other for many years." Fausto tilted his head, and his eyes narrowed in an almost imperceptible way, as if my answer had confirmed something he already suspected, or as if the lack of details was, in itself, a detail. He opened his mouth to ask another question, but didn't get to voice it. I felt it before I saw it. A hand settled on the small of my back, firm, warm, possessive in a way that didn't need force to communicate authority. Noah appeared beside me as if he'd materialized out of nowhere, standing, with his body slightly leaning in my direction and his eyes fixed on Fausto with the exact cordiality of someone who's being polite and dangerous at the same time. He didn't say a word to Fausto, didn't greet him, didn't smile, didn't make any of the gestures that the etiquette of that dinner required. He just stood there, with his hand on my back, and the weight of his presence transformed the air around the table into a magnetic field that only had room for 2 people, him and me. Fausto understood. Anyone with a minimum of survival instinct would have understood. "Excuse us," Noah said, and the phrase wasn't a request, it was a warning. His hand slid from my back to my elbow, and he guided me away from the table, with the naturalness of someone leading something that already belongs to them. I let myself be led, not because I didn't know how to resist, but because his touch on my back had sent a charge through my entire body that made any rational thought temporarily impossible. When I looked back, Fausto Rennie was smiling at our backs with a wine glass raised in our direction. A silent toast that wasn't celebration, it was study. The days following the wedding were a kind of elegant limbo. The Carbone mansion in Manhattan was exactly what Petra had described, too big for one person, and silent in a way that amplified every thought I tried to avoid. Cairo had given me a room on the second floor, with windows overlooking the interior garden, and a bed so large I could sleep diagonally and still not reach the edges. I tried to be useful. In the first few days, I went down to the kitchen, where 3 cooks worked in shifts, and insisted on preparing dinner myself. I made a risotto my mother taught me before she died, the only one I knew from memory, and that always gave me the feeling of being connected to something that was truly mine. I set the table in the smaller dining room, lit candles, and waited. Cairo didn't show up. Not that night, not the next. Not in any of the 3 that followed. I learned from Doriano Fante, the family's consigliere, an elegant 60-year-old man who rarely spoke but seemed to notice everything that happened in that house without effort, that the Don was in meetings until late, and that I shouldn't wait for him for meals. The message was clear, even though Doriano had delivered it with the contained kindness of someone who regrets something they can't change. I was Cairo Carbone's wife on paper, but inside that house, I was invisible. But that same night, when I went down to get water from the kitchen after midnight, I found the untouched risotto covered with plastic wrap in the refrigerator, and beside it, on the counter, a short note in the firm, slanted handwriting I'd already seen on documents in Cairo's office. It was good. I ate it before the meeting. Ask the chef to write down the recipe. I stood before that note for longer than made sense, trying to understand why 6 words written by a man who barely looked at me had managed to make something inside my chest shift. I tried to talk to him on 2 occasions. The first time, he was in the office and listened to me for 30 seconds before saying he needed to make a call. The second time, I found him in the hallway in the morning and wished him good morning. He responded with a nod and kept walking, but stopped 2 steps ahead and without turning said, "The garden has new jasmines. Your mother liked jasmines," and kept walking before I could ask how he knew that. There was no cruelty in it, no anger, no contempt, no identifiable feeling. There was only absence, but a strange absence, dotted with details that didn't make sense if Cairo were just the cold man he appeared to be. The note about the risotto, my mother's jasmines, things too small to mean something, and too present to mean nothing. And then came the relief, along with understanding. There would be no consummation. Cairo wouldn't touch me. I wouldn't have to share a bed with a 62-year-old man who looked at me as if I were a newly arrived piece of furniture. The certainty of this lifted a weight from my shoulders I'd been carrying since I was 18. But in place of that weight came another, different, and harder to define. I was trapped. Free from what I feared most, but trapped in everything else. The family dinner, at the end of the first week, was the first time everyone sat together at the large table. Cairo occupied the head with his usual distant presence. Doriano sat to his right, and 2 men I didn't know yet, business advisors, from what I gathered from the few words exchanged, occupied the chairs on the opposite side. I was placed in the middle of the table, and when I pulled out the chair to sit, Noah was already sitting to my left, as if he'd been there for hours. Bastian Krall, Noah's personal right-hand man, occupied the chair to my right. He was a 32-year-old man, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that seemed sculpted to express nothing. I knew who he was because Noah had called him by name when asking him to bring the wine. And by the way, Bastian obeyed without hesitation, with the automatic loyalty of someone who would follow Noah to the end of the world without asking a single question. Before dinner began, while the dishes were still being served, I saw something I shouldn't have seen. One of the kitchen staff, a young man, maybe 20, with visibly nervous hands, stumbled while placing the serving dish on the table and spilled sauce on the sleeve of Noah's jacket. The young man went white, the kind of white people turn when they know the mistake they just made could cost more than the job. The entire room seemed to hold its breath at the same time. Doriano looked up from his plate, the 2 advisors stopped chewing, and even Cairo shifted his gaze toward his son with an attention I hadn't seen him dedicate to anything since I'd arrived at that house. Noah looked at the stain on his jacket. Then he looked at the young man, who was so tense he seemed about to stop breathing, and then he took off his jacket, folded it over the back of the chair, and said, without raising his voice and without looking away from the employee, "Next time, hold it with both hands. Now get back to the kitchen before the chef notices the dish went out without the accompaniment." The young man left so fast he almost tripped again. Bastian, beside me, let out air through his nose in a sound that could have been laughter if his face knew how to do that, and Noah went back to looking at his own plate as if nothing had happened. But I stayed stuck in that moment longer than I should have, because the man who had just spared a scared boy with a dry, undramatic sentence was a version of Noah I didn't expect to find. A version that made everything more difficult, because desire I could fight, but desire mixed with respect was a combination I had no defense against. Dinner proceeded in tense silence until the second course, when Noah reached across in front of me to get to the breadbasket. He took a piece, placed it on my plate without asking if I wanted it, and in the same movement leaned toward me. His mouth stopped inches from my ear, and I felt the heat of his breath on the side of my neck before hearing the words. "You look beautiful by candlelight," he whispered, so low the words seemed to exist only between his mouth and my skin. "But you look more beautiful when you're angry with me." I stopped breathing. The fork was suspended in the air between the plate and my mouth, and I was certain that anyone who looked in my direction would notice that something had just happened beneath the surface of that table. My face was hot. My heart was somewhere between my throat and the ceiling, and I couldn't formulate a response because all the words I knew had decided to leave at the same time. Bastian, who was to my right with his eyes fixed on his own plate and the posture of a museum statue, said in a low voice, without looking up and without moving a single muscle in his face, "Not the most appropriate time, boss." Noah didn't move, didn't look at Bastian, just responded with the unshakable calm of someone who doesn't take orders from anyone, not even from their own common sense. "I know." And he leaned toward me again, even closer, and whispered something else I won't repeat. Not because it was vulgar, but because the way he said it made my entire body react in a way that shouldn't happen at a dinner table with his father sitting at the head less than 10 feet away. I pretended nothing had happened. Bastian pretended nothing had happened. Cairo continued eating with the same serene indifference as always. And Noah went back to eating his bread as if he hadn't just tilted the entire axis of my universe with a whispered sentence. After dinner, when the men retired to Cairo's office and the table was cleared, I left through the back door and went to the garden. I needed air. I needed a place where his whispers couldn't reach me, and where I could think with some clarity about what was happening to me, about the fact that I was married to one man and couldn't stop thinking about his son. The mansion's garden was surrounded by high walls covered in ivy, with a stone path that led to an iron bench beside a fountain that was turned off. I sat, took a deep breath, and closed my eyes, and for 30 seconds, I believed I was alone. "You ran away," his voice said behind me, and I didn't need to turn to know who it was. My body already knew. Every muscle stiffened, every nerve lit up, and the night air became heavier the instant he spoke. Noah appeared in my field of vision from the side, hands in his pockets, jacket open, tie loose. He stopped 2 steps from the bench and looked down at me with an expression that mixed amusement and something darker, something I still didn't have the courage to name. I stood up, because facing him sitting made me feel at a disadvantage, and crossed my arms in front of my body. "What do you want from me?" I asked, and my voice came out firmer than I expected. Firm and a little broken at the edges, like glass that's still standing but already has a crack down the middle. Noah looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something change in the depths of those dark eyes. A minimal fracture in the perfect composure, a flash of something that looked like raw honesty and didn't fit with anything I knew about him. And when he answered, his voice was low, without irony, without games, without any of the artifice I'd already learned to expect. Everything. The word hung suspended in the air between us like a sentence. And before I could say anything, before I could process the weight of that single syllable, he took a step back, took his hands out of his pockets, and left by the same stone path he'd come from, without looking back, without waiting for an answer, as if the answer were already his and he knew it before I did. I stood in the garden, with my heart racing and my arms still crossed, looking at the empty space where he'd been, and I thought, with a clarity that scared me, I was in danger. Not the kind that involves weapons or threats, the kind that involves a man who says everything like it's a promise, and makes you believe him. Chapter 4. The Kiss That Shouldn't Happen. Fausto Reni didn't leave after the wedding. I thought he would, that his presence that week was just the diplomatic gesture he'd described, but the days passed, and he kept appearing in the Carbone family's orbit like a shadow no one invited and no one sent away, always in the wrong place, always too close to me, always with that smile that showed too many teeth and eyes that held too many questions. On Tuesday, he was at the hotel restaurant where Cairo had a business meeting, and sat at the table next to mine as if the coincidence were the most natural thing in the world. He asked how I was adjusting to life as a Don's wife, and the way he pronounced the word wife carried a weight that made me cross my arms under the table. On Thursday, I found him in the mansion's lobby when I returned from a walk in the garden. He said he'd come to deliver documents to Doriano, but his eyes weren't looking toward the consigliere's office. They were on me. I didn't know what Fausto wanted, but I knew this man was gathering something. And that Thursday, standing in the lobby with the afternoon sun coming through the windows and Fausto Reni's calculated smile aimed in my direction, I made a decision I didn't ask anyone's permission to make. "Mr. Reni," I said, and this time I didn't pull back. I took a step toward him, with the trained smile my father taught me to use at business dinners, and that I'd never employed of my own volition. "You're always around here. I'm starting to think it's not Doriano's documents that bring you." Fausto raised an eyebrow. His smile didn't change, but something behind his eyes adjusted. The attention of a man who notices when the piece he thought was decoration starts moving on its own on the board. "You're observant," he said, tilting his head with an admiration that could be real, or could be another layer of performance. With Fausto, I suspected even admiration was strategic. "I grew up in a house where not being observant was dangerous," I replied, and let the sentence hang between us for a second before continuing. "You want to know about the marriage, about Cairo and me. I can see the question every time we meet." Fausto's smile diminished for the first time, replaced by something sharper, real interest, the kind he probably didn't expect to feel for a 22-year-old woman he'd been underestimating since the wedding dinner. "Then tell me," he said. "Cairo is a reserved man," I said, choosing each word with the care of someone arranging crystal pieces on a high shelf. "He's not effusive. He's not the type of husband who makes declarations or shows up with flowers, but he chose me, personally, above all the other options a man in his position would have had. And that, Mr. Reni, is all you need to know about this marriage." The lie came out whole, round, and flawless. And the most disturbing thing is that I hadn't rehearsed it. It was born ready, armed with exactly the right dose of partial truth to seem genuine. I was doing exactly what my father did at the dinners of my childhood, answering dangerous questions with phrases that seemed to open doors, and in reality, locked all of them. And for the first time, I didn't feel disgusted at resembling Armando Vetrano. I felt the kind of quiet power that comes from realizing you have an ability that can protect the right people, even if that ability was learned in the wrong circumstances. Fausto studied me for 3 long seconds. Then he raised his hand in an elegant gesture of surrender and said, "The Familia Carbone has a wife worthy of the name. My compliments to the Don." He left down the hallway, with the light step of someone who already has what they came for, or thinks they do. I stood in the lobby, with my heart racing and my hands sweating, and knew 2 things at once: that I'd bought time for the family, and that Fausto Reni wasn't a man who let himself be fooled for long. What I'd done in that lobby had consequences. I just didn't know which ones yet. I'd played my card, but the relief was short-lived, because in the days following the confrontation in the lobby, Fausto didn't back off. He just changed tactics. The direct questions disappeared, replaced by something worse: attentive silence. He stopped probing and started observing, and the way he looked at me and then at Noah, with surgical attention, as if measuring the distance between us and calculating what that distance meant, gave me the certainty that the lie I'd told in the lobby had bought time, not security. Fausto suspected something I myself still didn't have the courage to name, and my performance had only sharpened his curiosity instead of extinguishing it. Noah watched it all with the coldness I was beginning to understand was more dangerous than any explosion. He didn't confront Fausto, didn't make scenes. But I noticed, at dinners, in casual encounters in the hallways, that his eyes followed Fausto's every movement with the predatory patience of someone waiting for the exact moment to act. And that controlled calm scared me more than any anger would have, because anger has limits, and that didn't seem to. I tried to resist. In the days following the garden, I did everything to create distance between me and Noah. I avoided dinners when I could, invented excuses not to be in the same rooms, and when his presence was inevitable, I kept my eyes on the plate, the walls, the floor, anywhere that wasn't his face. But avoiding Noah Carbone inside a house that belonged to Noah Carbone was like trying to avoid the air I breathed. He was everywhere. In the sound of footsteps in the hallway in the morning, in the scent that lingered in the room after he left, in the empty chair at dinner that I knew would be filled by him at any moment. I was trying to ignore a storm that already lived inside my own house. On Friday night, almost 2 weeks after the wedding, I couldn't anymore. The mansion was silent. Cairo had left for a meeting that Doriano described only as delicate business, and most of the staff had already retired. I was lying in my room, staring at the ceiling, when I heard voices. They weren't loud voices. They were the kind of conversation that happens between people who know walls have ears, contained, grave, measured. But my room was close enough to the hallway that I could catch fragments when the house was in absolute silence. And that night the house was so silent, I could hear the clock from downstairs. It was Noah and Bastian. I didn't get up to listen. I didn't need to. The words came in pieces, like loose parts of a puzzle I hadn't asked to assemble. "It's not a question of loyalty, it's a question of time," Bastian said, and his voice had a tension I'd never heard before, as if the mask of inexpressiveness had cracks that only appeared when no one was looking. "Your father isn't going to be here forever, Noah, and when he's not, everything he built falls into your hands. Are you ready for that?" The silence that followed was long enough for me to hold my breath, and when Noah answered, his voice had none of the layers I knew. It wasn't deep and controlled, it wasn't provocative, it wasn't seductive, it was just honest, the kind of honesty that sounds like an open wound. "No," he said, "but that's never stopped anyone in this family." I heard footsteps moving away, a door closing, and then the silence returned. I lay in the dark with my heart beating in a rhythm that had nothing to do with fatigue. But for the first time, what I felt wasn't just attraction to the man sleeping 3 doors to the left of mine. It was something more complicated, the realization that Noah carried a weight I hadn't seen, and that the armor he wore around me was the same one he used to protect himself from everything else. I was afraid of what I felt for him, but in that instant, I was also afraid of what he felt alone. And I made the stupidest decision I could have made in that situation. I decided to go there and resolve it once and for all. The hallway was dark, and I walked barefoot on the wood floor, hearing each of my steps echo on the walls like an accusation. When I stopped in front of his bedroom door, the strip of light underneath told me he was awake. I knocked twice, firmly, because if I knocked softly I would give up, and the door opened almost immediately, as if he'd been waiting. Noah was without his jacket, without his tie, with his shirt sleeves rolled up to his elbows and his hair slightly out of place. The most human version of him I'd seen up to that moment. He looked at me standing at the door, in my nightgown and bare feet, and something in the depths of his eyes lit up and went out so fast I wasn't sure if I'd seen it or imagined it. He stepped back without saying anything, leaving space for me to enter. And I entered, because I was already there, and pulling back at that point would be worse than moving forward. Noah's room was larger than mine, and darker, with wood walls and an open window that let in the night air along with the distant sound of the city. There was a glass of whiskey half full on the table next to a leather armchair, and an open book he'd clearly been reading before I arrived. I stood in the middle of the room, with my arms crossed and my chin raised, trying to look more confident than I felt. "I need you to stop," I said, and my voice came out firmer than I expected, which gave me courage to continue. "The whispers, the looks, what happened in the garden, all of it needs to stop, Noah." He leaned against the door frame he'd just closed, crossed his arms in front of his chest, and listened to me, in silence, without interrupting, without smiling, without any of the reactions I'd prepared answers to counter. He just looked at me with those dark eyes and waited, and his silence was harder to face than any argument would have been. "What's happening between us isn't right," I continued, and this time the firmness in my voice began to crack at the edges, because saying it out loud made everything more real. "I'm married to your father. I live under the same roof as him, and every time you get close, every time you say these things, I feel like I'm betraying the only person who gave me a place in this world, even if that place is empty." The last part came out without permission. I didn't intend to admit I felt empty in Cairo's house, didn't intend to show that opening, but the words escaped and stayed between us like a confession I couldn't take back. Noah stayed silent for 3 more seconds. I counted, and then stepped away from the doorframe. He took a step toward me, just one, but that step changed the geometry of the entire room, because the distance between us went from safe to dangerous in less than a second. "You came to my room, barefoot, in the middle of the night, to ask me to stop," he said, and his voice was low, controlled, with a note of something that seemed almost like tenderness, if it weren't so dangerous. "And you're shaking." I was. I hadn't realized it until he said it, but my hands were shaking and my shoulders were tense, and I was breathing too fast for someone who'd come there with the intention of ending something. "I'm cold," I said, and it was the same lie I'd told Petra in the hotel room on the wedding day, and it worked as badly now as it had worked that day. Noah took another step. The distance between us was less than an outstretched arm. "Liar," he said, almost soundlessly, and the corner of his mouth curved into a half smile that wasn't amused. It was devastating, because it carried the weight of someone who knew exactly what I was feeling and wasn't going to pretend otherwise. I stepped back, he stepped forward, and the dynamic repeated once more, me backward, him forward, until my back pressed against the wood wall and there was nowhere left to go. Noah stopped inches from me, so close I felt the heat of his body passing through the thin fabric of my nightgown, and his eyes lowered to my mouth with the deliberate slowness of someone who knows time is on their side. I should have pushed him away, should have said something, anything, that would break that moment and return me to the dark hallway and the solitary safety of my room. But my entire body had decided to betray my head, because I didn't move, and when his hand came up and his fingers touched my chin, lifting my face toward his with a delicacy that didn't fit with anything I knew about this man. I closed my eyes instead of opening my mouth, and he kissed me. The kiss wasn't gentle. It wasn't careful. It wasn't any of the things a first kiss should be when the woman had never really been kissed before. It was urgent, deep, and inevitable, as if he'd been holding it in for too long, and the dam had broken the instant his lips found mine. The hand that was on my chin slid to the side of my face, and the other found my waist, pulling me against his body with a firmness that took the air from my lungs. I should have pulled away. That phrase repeated in my head like a distant alarm. I should. But my hands had already moved up to the front of his shirt, and were gripping the fabric as if they needed an anchor, and his mouth moved over mine in a way that made every rational thought dissolve before it finished forming. He tasted like whiskey, and heat, and something dark I couldn't name, and when he deepened the kiss, tilting his head and taking more of me than I knew I had to give, I made the most honest sound that had ever come from my mouth, a low, involuntary moan that died between his lips, and seemed to dissolve the last barrier that still existed between us. Noah changed. I felt the change happen, in the way his hands became firmer on my waist, in the breathing that became heavier against my skin, in his body that pressed me against the wall with a weight that was both intimidating and exactly what I needed to feel. But then, in a single instant, everything slowed down. He pulled back enough to look into my eyes, and what I saw in that face left me without ground, because it wasn't desire, or it wasn't just desire. It was a kind of reverence I didn't expect to find in a man the whole world feared. "I know you've never been with anyone," he said, and his voice was hoarse, lower than I'd ever heard it, with the cadence of someone choosing each word as if it could break something. "And I swear, Elisa, if you tell me to stop, I'll stop." I looked at him, at the dark eyes watching me with an intensity that should scare me, and didn't. At his hands still holding my waist, warm and firm, and careful in a way that contradicted everything this man represented. And I thought about Cairo, about the marriage, about the dress I didn't choose and the life that wasn't mine. I thought about the night I cried with my face in the pillow so no one would hear, about the empty hallway of the mansion where no one looked for me, about the meals alone, the good mornings without answers, the too big bed where I slept curled up on one side, only as if apologizing for taking up space. I thought about all of it, and knew, with a clarity that hurt, that this life wasn't life. It was just the organized absence of everything I needed. And then I thought about him, about the man standing before me with careful hands on my waist and the question in his eyes. The man who'd asked me if I was okay when no one else had bothered to ask. The man who looked at me as if I were the most real thing he'd ever seen. The guilt was there. I felt it like a physical weight in the center of my chest, and it said everything I already knew, that this was wrong, that I was married, that the consequences would be greater than I could bear. But along with the guilt, there was something else, older and stronger, the certainty that if I left that room now, I would be choosing obedience over myself, and I'd already obeyed my whole life. "Don't stop," I said, and my voice didn't tremble. For the first time, it didn't tremble. He carried me in his arms as if I were made of porcelain and air, effortless, the muscles of his shoulders firm beneath my hands. My feet barely touched the floor. When he laid me down on the dark satin sheets, the cold contrast against my warm back drew a low sigh from me. The soft light of the lamp gilded his skin, and I saw something in his eyes that went beyond desire, an almost painful reverence, as if he were standing before something sacred. His hands traveled over my body, over the thin chemise, slowly, with a deliberate lingering that made the air between us hum. His fingers traced the curve of my breasts, moved down my waist, and contoured my hips as if he were drawing my body for the first time, and for the 1,000th. They stopped at the hem of the garment. He looked up into my eyes, silent, patient. I waited a second, my heart hammering, and nodded. The chemise rose slowly, sliding over my skin like an extra caress. The cool air brushed against my bust, my belly, the valley between my thighs. I shivered, not from the cold, from being entirely exposed under that gaze that seemed to drink me in whole. He noticed the tremor, and without a word, covered my body with his. The weight was perfect, warm, solid, protective. His broad chest pressed against mine, and I felt his heart beating hard, rhythmic, nearly as fast as my own. His lips found the curve of my neck, hot, open, wet kisses. His tongue traced a slow line to my earlobe, and I arched my body against him, a low whisper escaping without permission. His hand slid down my flank, his fingers firm but controlled, squeezing the soft flesh of my hip as if he needed to anchor himself. I could feel his hardness against my thigh, hot and throbbing, but he didn't rush anything. He was holding back, for me. "You're so beautiful like this," he murmured against my skin, his voice husky and deep. so surrendered, so mine. His lips moved down. Slowly, they kissed my collarbone, the cleavage between my breasts. When his warm mouth closed around my breast, if you know what I mean, sucking gently, I gripped the sheets hard, my fingers tangling in the fabric. A jolt of pleasure shot up my spine. He alternated, slow tongue, delicate suction, teeth grazing lightly, enough to make me arch, enough to make me forget to breathe. Breathe, he whispered against the wet nipple, his warm breath sending fresh shivers through me. I obeyed, letting out my breath in a long, shaky sigh, almost a surrender. He continued downward, kisses along my belly, the curve of my waist. His hands parted my thighs with gentleness, reverent. When his mouth found the center of my pleasure, I lost my breath again. His tongue was slow, precise, exploring every fold, every sensitive spot as if he had all the time in the world. 2 fingers slid inside me, curving at the exact spot, and I unraveled in long, deep waves, holding his head against me while my body trembled and contracted around him. Only then did he move back up. Our eyes met. He positioned himself between my legs, the thick, hot tip pressing against my wet entrance. He entered slowly, inch by inch, his eyes fixed on mine, watching my every reaction. When he was completely inside, filling me entirely, we stayed like that for a long moment, connected, pulsing, breathing the same air. Then the movement began, slow, deep. Each thrust was a silent declaration. His hips rolled with precision, his body covering mine, his arms around my shoulders as if he wanted to protect me from the very pleasure he was giving me. I wrapped my legs around his back, my heels pressing into his lower back, pulling him deeper. The sounds were soft, skin against skin, ragged breaths, low and husky moans. He only accelerated when he felt my body tighten around him again. His hand slid between us, his thumb circling my swollen lower lips, and I came for the second time, harder, longer, digging my nails into his back as I called his name in a broken whisper. He followed right after. With a deep, low groan, he buried his face in my neck and poured himself into me, his body shaking, his hips making short, intense movements until the last spasm. We stayed like that, joined, sweaty, breathless. He rolled to the side without pulling out of me completely and pulled me against his chest. My face tucked perfectly into the space between his shoulder and neck, his heartbeat strong against my cheek. I lazily traced the muscles of his abs with my fingertips, feeling him still pulsing inside me. For a long time, there was only the comfortable silence, synchronized breathing, and shared warmth. He carried me in his arms, as if I were made of porcelain and air, effortless, the muscles of his shoulders firm beneath my hands. My feet barely touched the floor. When he laid me down on the dark satin sheets, the cold contrast against my warm back drew a low sigh from me. The soft light of the lamp gilded his skin, and I saw something in his eyes that went beyond desire, an almost painful reverence, as if he were standing before something sacred. His hands traveled over my body over the thin chemise, slowly, with a deliberate lingering that made the air between us hum. His fingers traced the curve of my breasts, moved down my waist, and contoured my hips as if he were drawing my body for the first time, and for the 1000th. They stopped at the hem of the garment. He looked up into my eyes, silent, patient. I waited a second, my heart hammering, and nodded. The chemise rose slowly, sliding over my skin like an extra caress. The cool air brushed against my bust, my belly, the valley between my thighs. I shivered, not from the cold, from being entirely exposed under that gaze that seemed to drink me in whole. He noticed the tremor, and without a word, covered my body with his. The weight was perfect, warm, solid, protective. His broad chest pressed against mine, and I felt his heart beating hard, rhythmic, nearly as fast as my own. His lips found the curve of my neck, hot, open, wet kisses. His tongue traced a slow line to my earlobe, and I arched my body against him, a low whisper escaping without permission. His hand slid down my flank, his fingers firm but controlled, squeezing the soft flesh of my hip, as if he needed to anchor himself. I could feel his hardness against my thigh, hot and throbbing, but he didn't rush anything. He was holding back, for me. "You're so beautiful like this," he murmured against my skin, his voice husky and deep. So surrendered, so mine. His lips moved down, slowly. They kissed my collarbone, the cleavage between my breasts. When his warm mouth closed around my breast, if you know what I mean, sucking gently, I gripped the sheets hard, my fingers tangling in the fabric. A jolt of pleasure shot up my spine. He alternated, slow tongue, delicate suction, teeth grazing lightly, enough to make me arch. Enough to make me forget to breathe. "Breathe," he whispered against the wet nipple, his warm breath sending fresh shivers through me. I obeyed, letting out my breath in a long, shaky sigh, almost a surrender. He continued downward, kisses along my belly, the curve of my waist. His hands parted my thighs with gentleness, reverent. When his mouth found the center of my pleasure, I lost my breath again. His tongue was slow, precise, exploring every fold, every sensitive spot, as if he had all the time in the world. 2 fingers slid inside me, curving at the exact spot, and I unraveled in long, deep waves, holding his head against me while my body trembled and contracted around him. Only then did he move back up. Our eyes met. He positioned himself between my legs, the thick, hot tip pressing against my wet entrance. He entered slowly, inch by inch, his eyes fixed on mine, watching my every reaction. When he was completely inside, filling me entirely, we stayed like that for a long moment, connected, pulsing, breathing the same air. Then the movement began. Slow, deep. Each thrust was a silent declaration. His hips rolled with precision, his body covering mine. His arms around my shoulders as if he wanted to protect me from the very pleasure he was giving me. I wrapped my legs around his back, my heels pressing into his lower back, pulling him deeper. The sounds were soft, skin against skin, ragged breaths, low and husky moans. He only accelerated when he felt my body tighten around him again. His hand slid between us, his thumb circling my swollen lower lips, and I came for the second time, harder, longer, digging my nails into his back as I called his name in a broken whisper. He followed right after. With a deep, low groan, he buried his face in my neck and poured himself into me, his body shaking, his hips making short, intense movements until the last spasm. We stayed like that, joined, sweaty, breathless. He rolled to the side without pulling out of me completely and pulled me against his chest, my face tucked perfectly into the space between his shoulder and neck, his heartbeat strong against my cheek. I lazily traced the muscles of his abs with my fingertips, feeling him still pulsing inside me. For a long time, there was only the comfortable silence, synchronized breathing, and shared warmth. And then, slowly, reality returned. It came slowly, like a rising tide, and brought with it the weight of everything I'd just done. I was lying in my husband's son's bed, naked, in his arms, in the same house where Cairo Carbone slept 3 doors to the right, believing his wife was in her own room, alone, innocent, faithful. Panic rose up my throat like bile. I sat up in bed and searched for my nightgown in the dark, with shaking hands and my stomach twisted with guilt. Noah moved behind me. I felt his hand touch my shoulder, warm and firm, trying to bring me back. "Elisa," he said, and my name in Noah's mouth sounded different from anywhere else, sounded like it belonged there, and that made everything worse. "No," I said, putting on my nightgown inside out and not caring. I couldn't look at him. If I looked, I would stay. If I stayed, I would lose myself completely. This shouldn't have happened. I left the room without looking back, without closing the door, without saying anything else. I crossed the hallway barefoot and entered my room like someone entering a confessional. I closed the door, leaned my back against it, and slid to the floor. I cried there, in the dark, with his scent still on my skin and his taste still in my mouth, and each tear carried the double weight of a guilt that was destroying me and a feeling I couldn't tear out, because the truth, the horrible, inescapable, cruel truth, was that I didn't regret what had happened. I regretted liking it so much. The days that followed were a wasteland. I locked myself in my room and didn't appear at dinners. When a staff member knocked on the door to ask if I needed anything, I said I wasn't feeling well and asked to be left alone. Petra called 3 times. I saw her name lighting up the phone screen and didn't answer any of them, because Petra knew me too well, and it would only take hearing my voice to know something had happened, and I wasn't ready to put into words what I'd done. I avoided mirrors, avoided leaving the room after 10 at night, avoided thinking about his name, his scent, the way he'd said breathe against my skin as if he knew I was forgetting to do it because of him. And I failed at all these attempts, every time, without exception. On the 5th morning of isolation, when I was already beginning to think I could get through the rest of my life, avoiding the entire world, my phone vibrated on the nightstand. It wasn't Petra. It wasn't an unknown number. It was an internal mansion number, the direct line from the main office. The message was short, direct, and each word weighed like a sentence. Living room. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. We need to talk. Cairo, I read the message 3 times. The first time my hands trembled. The second time my stomach sank. The third time I dropped the phone on the bed and stared at the ceiling with the cold certainty that Cairo knew, that everything was over, that tomorrow, at 10 o'clock, my life as I knew it would end. Chapter 5. The Agreement. I didn't sleep. I lay awake all night staring at the bedroom ceiling, with Cairo's message burned into my head like a brand. We need to talk. 3 words that, coming from anyone else, could mean anything, but coming from the Don of the Familia Carbone, from the same family whose motto was Il sangue non mente, and whose way of punishing betrayal was permanent silence, meant only one thing: he knew. At 9:47 in the morning, I looked at the clock 3 times before leaving the room, because I needed something concrete to anchor my thoughts before they dragged me to the bottom. I went down the stairs with trembling legs and a dry mouth. I wore what I found first in the closet, a simple dark dress, without any detail that could be mistaken for vanity. I pulled my hair back, because I didn't want anything on my face that could distract me from what was coming, and I stopped in front of the living room door for exactly 12 seconds, before gathering what little courage I had left and turning the doorknob. Cairo was sitting in the armchair by the window, legs crossed and a cup of coffee in his right hand. The morning light came through the half-open curtains and illuminated his profile in a way that made him look older and more human than I'd ever seen. The lines around his eyes, the impeccable gray hair, the large, weathered hands that held the cup with the same calm they probably held the fate of dozens of people every day. He didn't stand when I entered. He just moved his eyes in my direction and nodded toward the opposite armchair, in a gesture that wasn't invitation or order. It was something between the two. Like almost everything with Cairo Carbone, I sat. My hands were freezing and I hid them under my thighs so he wouldn't see the trembling, though I was certain a man like Cairo noticed these things without needing to look. My heart was racing so fast I could feel it in my throat, and each second of silence between us weighed like a minute. "Coffee?" he asked, raising his cup in my direction. "No, thank you," I replied, and my voice came out thin and trembling in a way that irritated me, because I wanted to at least look whole while my life fell apart. Cairo took a slow sip of coffee, placed the cup on the saucer with a delicate click, and looked at me. His look wasn't angry, wasn't accusatory, wasn't any of the things I'd spent all night rehearsing answers to face. It was calm, and the calmness scared me more than fury would have, because I didn't know how to defend myself against a man who wasn't attacking. "I'm not blind, Elisa," he said, and his voice had the same measured cadence as always, as if commenting on the weather or the quality of the coffee. "I see how you look at Noah. I see how he looks at you, and I know what happened between you." The ground disappeared beneath me. I felt the blood leave my face and descend to somewhere that had no name, and my hands, which were hidden under my thighs, began to shake with a violence I couldn't control. The air became too thick to breathe, and the entire room seemed to tilt a few degrees to the left, as if gravity had decided to change direction to match the disaster unfolding before me. I opened my mouth to say something, to deny, to apologize, to beg for the kind of forgiveness I knew I didn't deserve. But what came out wasn't any of those things. What came out was silence, heavy and exposed, because the lie didn't come, and the truth was too big to fit in any sentence. And then Cairo did something I didn't expect, something that didn't belong to any of the scenarios my mind had constructed during the entire sleepless night. He smiled. It wasn't a big smile. It wasn't warm or open or any of the qualities we normally associate with a smile. It was small, contained, almost reluctant, as if his face wasn't used to making that movement and needed a second to remember how it worked. But it was there, real, on the lips of the coldest man I'd ever known. "I think you need to hear a story," he said, and leaned back in the armchair with the posture of someone preparing to speak for longer than was his custom. I didn't move, didn't blink, wasn't sure if I was breathing. Cairo began to speak, and each sentence that came from his mouth turned the world I knew upside down. He told me that Armando Vetrano, my father, had approached him years before the wedding with a proposal, the daughter in exchange for protection and territory. Armando wanted a Don to seal the alliance. He wouldn't accept anything less than Cairo himself as husband, because the title of the Don's wife was the only currency with enough weight to guarantee the kind of security he wanted for the Vetrano family business. Cairo accepted, but not for the reason Armando imagined. "I'd already noticed," Cairo said, and for the first time since I'd known him, his voice carried something that seemed like kindness, though he disguised it too well for me to be sure. "Long before Armando approached me, long before the marriage was even a possibility, I'd already noticed the way my son looked at you. Noah never knew how to hide it from me. And look, he hides almost everything." I felt the tears coming before I realized I was crying. They ran down my face in silence, without sobbing, without sound, just falling, one after another, while pieces I never knew were scattered began to fit into a picture I hadn't imagined. Cairo continued. He said the formal marriage was the only way to satisfy Armando's demand, and at the same time, keep Elisa within the family's domain, protected, close, where Noah could be within her reach, without the outside world knowing. Legally, I was Cairo Carbone's wife. Inside that house, I always belonged to the sun. The agreement had been made between Cairo and Noah before the wedding. Noah had known from the beginning, and had accepted Cairo's condition that no one outside the mansion could discover the truth, because the day Armando or any rival found out, the entire structure would collapse. Out there, you're my wife, Cairo said, with the pragmatic firmness I already knew, but without any coldness this time. Inside this house, Elisa, you always belonged to Noah, and I made sure it was that way because, despite what people think about me, I'm not a man who traps a 22-year-old woman in a dead marriage to satisfy the ego of a father who never deserved to have a daughter like you. The last sentence broke me. I collapsed in the armchair, not from sadness, not from anger, but from a relief so immense and so violent that my body didn't know how to process it except by falling apart. I cried with my face in my hands and laughed between the sobs, and didn't know what I was doing because both things were happening at the same time, and neither seemed enough to contain what I was feeling. I stood up without thinking. I crossed the space between the two armchairs in 2 steps, and hugged Cairo Carbone, the Don of the Familia, the most feared man in that city, the husband I thought was my jailer, and who, in reality, had been my shield this entire time. My arms wrapped around his shoulders, and I buried my face in the chest of his impeccable suit, and he froze for 2 whole seconds, body rigid, arms motionless at his sides, as if no one had hugged him in so long he'd forgotten what it was like. And then, slowly, with the hesitation of a man who didn't know how to make that gesture anymore but was trying to remember, he raised one hand and gave 2 light, awkward pats on my back. It wasn't a real hug. It was the most Cairo Carbone knew how to offer, and for some reason, that made me cry even more. "Thank you," I said against his suit, my voice muffled and wet with tears. "Thank you, Cairo. Don't thank me," he replied, and his voice had returned to its usual pragmatic tone, though the pats on my back hadn't stopped. "Just don't ruin my suit. This is the only one I tolerate before noon." I laughed. I really laughed, with my face wet and my nose red, and the absurd feeling that the world had spun 180 degrees in the last 10 minutes, and I still didn't know where north was. I stepped back, wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, and looked at Cairo with an honesty I'd never felt safe having around him. "I'm in love with him," I said. And the confession came out whole, without hesitation, without shame, because for the first time since I'd set foot in that house, I didn't need to hide anything. Cairo looked at me with an expression I couldn't classify, something between resignation and a kind of discreet satisfaction, as if the confirmation of a well-executed plan was as comforting as any display of affection. "Then why don't you tell him?" Cairo said, and there was in his tone the patience of someone who already knew the answer before asking the question. I swallowed hard. The idea of saying that to Noah, of opening my mouth and putting out the words I'd barely admitted to myself, made my heart race again, but this time it wasn't fear. It was something else, something that looked like the beginning of something instead of the end. "Because I don't know how," I replied, and my voice failed at the end of the sentence in a way that made me look exactly like what I was, a 22-year-old woman who'd never said I love you to anyone and had no idea how to start. Cairo raised his eyes to a point behind me, and the corner of his mouth moved in that small, reluctant smile from before. "Turn around," he said. My heart stopped. I felt it before I saw it, the same way I'd felt it at the ceremony, at the dinner, in the garden, in his room at night. That unmistakable presence that changed the weight of the air and made every nerve in my body light up as if I'd been designed to detect it. And when I turned, slowly, with my hands still wet with tears and my face still red, Noah was there. Leaning against the living room doorframe, arms crossed and eyes fixed on me. I didn't know how long he'd been there, if he'd heard everything, if he'd heard only the end, if he'd heard the part where I said I was in love with him with the same naturalness one says the sun rises in the east. But the expression on his face gave me the answer. He'd heard everything. I turned red from head to toe. The heat rose up my neck, my cheeks, the tips of my ears, and if I could have disappeared into the carpet at that moment, I would have gladly done so. Because it was one thing to feel it in silence, in the dark, hidden inside my own head, and another was knowing he'd just heard the most exposed confession I'd ever made in my life. Noah pushed off the doorframe and walked toward me, not in a hurry, not with the urgency of the night in his room. This time, he walked with the calm of someone who knows they don't need to run anymore, that they don't need to calculate anymore, that the distance between us was finally closing by free choice and not by impulse stolen in the dark. He stopped in front of me, close enough for me to feel his warmth and the scent I'd already memorized without meaning to. Woody, warm, dangerously familiar. And then his arms wrapped around me from behind, crossing over my chest, pulling me against his body with a possessiveness that was no longer forbidden, no longer hidden, no longer anything but exactly what it should be. His mouth descended to my ear, that space he'd already claimed as his territory since the waiting room at the ceremony, and his voice came out low, hoarse, with the cadence of someone saying something they'd kept for too long. "You're going to say that again," he whispered, and I felt each word vibrate against my skin like a brand. Inside that room, I didn't answer with words. I turned my face toward him, and the kiss that happened wasn't like the first. It wasn't urgency. It wasn't a dam breaking. It wasn't desperation. It was slow, deep, deliberate. The kind of kiss that happens when two people stop fighting the same thing and decide, together, that what they feel is stronger than any obstacle the world placed between them. Cairo cleared his throat behind us with the embarrassed discretion of a man who'd anticipated that moment, but hadn't calculated he'd need to witness it. "I'm still here," he said, and the tone was so dry it drew a low laugh from Noah and made me hide my face in his chest, red and unable to control the smile that took over my mouth. "Excuse us, Dad," Noah said, without releasing his arms from around me, and the word Dad had never sounded so loaded with meaning, with gratitude, with respect, with something the two of them understood, and that needed no further explanation. Cairo waved his hand in a gesture that was both permission and relief, and Noah guided me out of the room with his hand on the small of my back, the same possessive touch from the wedding dinner, but this time without guilt, without shadow, without any of the invisible chains that had weighed on us since the first moment. That night, lying beside him in the room that was now ours, I found myself thinking about the white dress, about the hotel mirror, about the woman I was that morning, the one who hadn't chosen anything and thought she'd never have that permission. And I looked at Noah sleeping beside me, with his face softer than anyone would ever see it awake, and understood that, for the first time in my life, I'd made a choice. Not a safe choice, not an easy choice, but a choice that was mine. The guilt had gone away, the fear had gotten smaller, and what remained, what had always been there, since the wrong door at the hotel, since the handshake that lasted too long, since the whisper in the waiting room that I pretended not to hear, was just what we'd always been to each other. I rested my head on his shoulder and closed my eyes, and for the first time in weeks, I slept without dreaming about anything, because reality finally was better than any dream I could invent, until everything became a nightmare again. Lena here. That wraps up Book 1, and I've already finished Book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee. The name was there. My name. In large letters on a television screen I didn't ask to see. Elisa Vetrano, wife of Don Cairo Carbone, caught with the sun. Photographs. Noah and me on a balcony in Positano, my hand in his. The way he looked at me. Everything that was ours in secret was now public. The phone vibrated in my hand. It was Petra. Then it vibrated again. It was a number I hadn't saved, but I recognized it. The Palermo area code. My father. I looked at the screen, at my name in the news, at my father's name calling, and I knew that everything we'd built was about to collapse. As you can see, that was just a little taste of Book 2. To watch the full uncensored version, just click the first link in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in just a few seconds. Just a reminder, click that first link down in the comments, and the complete Book 2, ad-free and uninterrupted, will be waiting for you. It's that simple. I'm absolutely loving working on Book 2, and since you guys are loving it too, I promise there's more to come. This is where you'll find stories that get even steamier, true dark romance. And because this version is getting so much more spicy, the video wouldn't be well received publicly on YouTube. This private space is where I can really show my true essence, and where I feel free to do my best work for you all. Keep in mind that the channel has been demonetized. So this is a way for me to keep my team together and continue bringing high-quality stories to you. I'll have even more updates for you soon. I'll be waiting for you at that first link in the pinned comment. Unfortunately, many people have been downloading our audio, effectively copying the entire story, and simply reposting it on YouTube. If you want to watch the original story and be the first to receive the next ones, search for My Stories by Lena on YouTube to get the best dark romance content. Remember, the official channel is My Stories by Lena on YouTube. I'll be waiting for you there.